Good afternoon. I'm Wells Hall, Chair of the Tax Section, and we're pleased to have everyone here for the Plenary Session Luncheon. I hope everyone has enjoyed a great meeting. Those of whom I've spoken about it have been very pleased with our back to normalcy May meeting of the Section of Taxation. Thank you. We have nearly 1,700 members and speakers registered at this meeting, which is great news after a couple of years of COVID-19 virtual meetings. Although last year we had a very successful May meeting. And I want to start my remarks today by thanking our sponsors. The sponsors are listed on the screen, but I want to recognize Synergy Partners, Tax Analysts, and Haynes Boone LLP, who are diamond sponsors, contributing not only at that level to attain recognition, but also serving as exhibitors and panelists on various panels. So we're glad to have their support for this meeting. Thank you to our Ruby and Emerald sponsors, who are also listed on the screen. And we want to recognize Thompson Reuters and the educational affiliate of the tax lawyer, the Northwestern Graduate Tax Program, for their long-time support of the section through the tax lawyer publication. We're also blessed to have approximately 250 members of the IRS Chief Counsel's Office in attendance at this meeting, serving on panels, sitting in the audience, running exhibition booths, and we know that everyone appreciates their participation. And we hope it's a two-way street. I hope they get as much out of it, of our involvement with them, as we do their involvement with us. Perhaps most important in the expressing of appreciation category is the thanks that we owe to our section staff who put this meeting together. Let's give them a hand. Before we move on to our awards and keynote speech, I want to make a few announcements. That's great. Thank you. Our fall 2023 meeting will be a virtual meeting on October the 16th through the 20th. The virtual format allows us to reach a lot of section members who are not able to travel and be in attendance at our live meetings. We decided to move the fall meeting, which is one of the lesser attended meetings of our 3 meetings, big meetings a year, to a virtual setting, and we're hopeful that we'll have good participation. Again, that's going to be the dates are October the 16th through the 20th. We're going to have quality CLE programs, as those of you who participated in the virtual programs in 21 and 22 know. We're able to spotlight committees with 90-minute presentations and spread it out over a period of time where you can enjoy that, or within 90 days after the presentation, go back and view it later. I also want to mention our virtual settlement program. We have started a pilot program, we call it our Virtual Settlement Weeks, and after 2 successful pilots, the next one will be July the 19th through the 21st, and registration is now open now through the section website. You don't need any prior pro bono experience to participate in the settlement weeks. Volunteers will assist pro se taxpayers in resolving active cases with the Internal Revenue Service, and members can register for LITC Connect through our partner, the Center for Taxpayer Rights, and be connected to full representation of cases referred by the low-income taxpayer clinics. I'd also encourage everyone to continue to support our JEDI Endowment Fund. That's our diversity, equity, and inclusion program that we're funding to award support for the Loretta Collins Argret Fellowship, which we have 8 fellows that were named last year, and we have 5 new fellows that I'll mention in a few minutes. Please consider making a charitable deductible contribution to the Jedi Endowment Fund. Our inaugural class of Argret Fellows are here with us today. I'm not sure how many are in the audience. If you are here, you're last year Argret Fellow, would you raise your hand or stand? Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to recognize the second class, which begin their fellowships at the fall meeting. And I'm not sure how many of them are here, but they have been notified, and I will recognize them. Goulburn Maynard, who's with Indiana University, the Kelley School of Business. If you are here, please stand so we can recognize you. Jorge Oben, who's with the Office of Chief Counsel International. Great. Sonia Sheikh with Miles and Stockbridge. Sonia Watson with the U.S. Tax Court. And Linda Whitfield with Loyola Marymount University, the Loyola Law School. We also would like to recognize our 2022-2023 John S. Nolan Fellows, who we name every year a class of fellows who attend. This is our last year's class who are wrapping up their fellowships at this meeting. And now for our new class of fellows for the 2023-24 class, Bibiana Cruz, Omid Farouzi, Brian Gardner, Samuel Lappin, Josh Savay, and Caitlin Tharp. Let's give them a hand. We also appreciate the contributions of our Brunswick Fellows. We have 2 Brunswick Fellows serving now, and we have selected 2 new Fellows for the coming year, and we'll be coming out with that announcement very soon. We also have nominations open now for the 2023-24, 23-25 Tax Analyst Public Service Fellowship, which is a mirror of the Christine Brunswick Fellowship, but supported by our sponsor, Tax Analysts. This is designed to be filled by a more experienced tax attorney who takes a little more difficult, challenging position with a low-income taxpayer clinic or in a place where they can really do some good work. Anyone interested in that or knowing someone that's deserving, nominations are open through June the 30th. The Distinguished Service Award is the highest honor awarded by the Section of Taxation. At your seats, you have a little summary of the background and the deserving nominee for the award who we'll recognize momentarily. The award is designed to recognize someone who's had a distinguished career in taxation and who's provided an aspirational standard for all tax lawyers to emulate. It's my honor and pleasure to recognize our 2023 Distinguished Service Award recipient, Pamela F. Olson. Hold just a minute. I will not try to detail all of her accomplishments and background, which are in the summary, but I'd like to say a few things and a few comments. Pam was born and raised in Minnesota and got her BA, magna cum laude, MBA, and JD at the University of Minnesota. She started her tax career in 1981 as a trial lawyer with the San Diego District Counsel's Office of the Internal Revenue Service. She moved from San Diego to Washington, D.C. to become an attorney advisor in the IRS Legislation and Regulations Division, and then she was special assistant to then IRS Chief Counsel Fred Goldberg. In 1986, Pam joined the Washington office of Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher and Flom and was promoted to partner in 1990. At Skadden, she became very involved with the section of taxation. Among other things, in moving through the leadership, she was vice chair of committee operations and then chair of the section in 2000. She was the first woman to ever serve as chair of the section of taxation. During her term as chair, she was selected by the George W. Bush administration to be Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, where she led the administration's efforts to enact the 2001 Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act. In September 2002, she was confirmed as Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, again, the first woman to serve in that position, and led the administration's efforts to enact the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, which, as you recall, included measures to relieve the double tax on corporate earnings and dividend distributions. As noted in the handout, Pam, and this is a quote, is noteworthy for her interpersonal skills and ability to manage a multiplicity of relationships to find mutually agreeable solutions to challenging problems. Pam is exceptional in her ability to remain focused and calm, absorbing stress without conveying it to those around her, including those who work under her. Pam's thoughtful judgment is sought after and respected by all. Pam left government service in 2004 and returned to Skadden, where she was head of the Washington, D.C. tax practice until 2011. She then joined PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, as a partner, as deputy tax leader and Washington National Tax Services leader until she retired from the partnership in 2020. She had then continued as a senior tax policy advisor at PwC, where she finds many clients continuing to draw upon her experience and expertise. Pam's distinguished service to the profession has drawn many recognitions, several of which are mentioned in the handout. And it's our pleasure to present her with our highest recognition of lifetime achievements and contributions to the profession, our Distinguished Service Award. Pam, if you will step up to the podium, I'd like to present this to you. And please share some remarks.
Well, I think I was trying to cut that short because I never like to have people talk about me. Anyway, thank you, Wells, and thank you, Eric Solomon, for doing that write-up. One of the things I learned from Eric after I left Treasury was the extent to which I had absorbed the pressures of the office without passing it on. I don't think I quite realized it while I was there, but at any rate, it's one of the highest compliments I've ever received, so I thank you for that, Eric. I also want to thank the tax section for this incredible honor. It's a little overwhelming to stand up here. I have 9-year-old twin grandchildren. When they heard I was getting an award, they assumed the award was for baking cookies. And they were really quite disappointed to learn that it was not the case. So my opportunity today is making brief remarks. Nothing like having the commissioner speak after you to fill the room and make you feel like, oh, you came to, no, I know better. You came to hear the commissioner. So brief remarks, I'd like to use a couple of tricks I learned from my congressional friends to lengthen them without lengthening them. First, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of last year's award winner, Karen Hawkins, whose speech lit up this room a year ago. I don't know if Karen's here. I haven't seen her. But if she is, thank you, Karen. And for those of you who were here, I'm sure you remember them. Second Wells, I might request the opportunity to revise and extend my remarks later. So I'm from Minnesota, as the bio says, where we have a saying, we're humble people with much to be humble about. So that naturally leads me to the question, what am I doing here? I was on the Tax Section Council when the decision was made to begin giving a Distinguished Service Award. And the first award went to Jack Nolan, who, for many of us, was the dean of the tax bar. I had the great fortune of working with Jack on ABA projects. Jack epitomized service. He served his clients, he served the tax system, he served the profession. He was a gracious mentor to me and many young lawyers. The Nolan Fellowship honors his legacy. I've had the great fortune of serving with many of the individuals who received the Distinguished Service Award in prior years. And the reason I'm here is because of what I learned from them and from many other friends, colleagues, and mentors over the years. I've got a small reunion going on up here at the first couple of tables. My family has all moved west, which is why I have as well. And I decided what I'd really like to do is surround myself with the people that I've surrounded myself with my career. And so a lot of people that I worked in particular in the government with are here, and I'm delighted to have them here. I'm going to talk about them in a bit. But I also learned a lot from my husband, a trade lawyer with a passing interest in tax. While in government, he served on a task force on worldwide combined unitary taxation, proving that ideas never actually die. This is one that's back, making the news today. And replacing the FISC rules with the extraterritorial income exclusion. I'm looking at Barbara Angus and Mark Prater and Janice Mays. They all remember all these things. That was following the U.S.'s loss at the WTO, which was to be followed by another loss because the extraterritorial income exclusion didn't pass muster either. Anyway, our neighbors often joked about how boring our dinner table conversations must be. Trade clearly won out as the more interesting topic over tax. Our son's first email handle was Free Trade 101. Nothing about tax in there. Now, if you happen to know my husband, Grant, you've probably heard some of his jokes at tax lawyers' expense. He once filled in for Mark Prater at an ABA Tax Section Plenary Session because Mark was stuck on the Hill and couldn't make the trip. And Grant was at the time also working on the Senate Finance Committee with Mark. And he got up and described tax lawyers as speed bumps on the global trade superhighway. Anyway, among his other jokes, we confuse tax with another three-letter word ending in X. He says tax lawyers lack a sense of humor. I tell him his jokes just aren't funny. Speaking of which, one of the highlights of my career was writing Marty Ginsburg's Distinguished Service Award bio. Marty's remarks, after suggesting the award committee must have been drinking when they decided to give it to him, were the story he told here in this very lunch for the first time of giving RBG the advance sheets that led to the landmark equal protection decision and later the movie on the basis of sex. Although Marty made light of his contributions, many of us benefited from Marty's willingness to share his knowledge and experience. Eric and Barbara will both remember the hours Marty spent thinking through issues and options when we were at Treasury working out the details of the 2003 dividend exclusion proposal. But returning to the topic of service and mentorship, as I look back on my career, what stands out is how much I owe to my government service and to my ABA service. So I want to recognize some of those friends that I mentioned from my time in the government who are here and whose friendship and mentorship have meant so much to me. First, Fred Goldberg, the only person to hold the tax hat trick. IRS Chief Counsel, Commissioner, and Assistant Secretary. Fred's willingness to give me responsibility, trust my judgment, that was really questionable, Fred, and introduce me to members of the bar at the ABA tax section meeting, first one I attended in January of 1985. That enriched my career immeasurably. I learned much from two other legends of the tax bar early in my career, B. John Williams and Ken Gideon. Ken is, of course, no longer with us, and B. John couldn't be here today, but I'm grateful to both of them for their friendship and constructive criticism throughout my career. Nina Olson. Nina, my adopted identical twin sister. Nina and I were both in the government at the same time. She began as the National Taxpayer Advocate shortly after I joined Treasury, and every once in a while I'd pick up a tax notes piece and see Olson says, and I thought, what? I didn't say that. And I looked, oh, okay, the other, my adopted identical twin sister. So Nina, who spent 18 years, that's close to a life sentence, as the IRS National Taxpayer Advocate. Emily Parker once said that if the tax system were a dog, the National Taxpayer Advocate would be the fire hydrant. Anyway, Nina worked with me tirelessly while I was at Treasury on improving the filing system for low-income taxpayers, and I'm very grateful for that. Kevin Brown. Kevin, who's no drama practicality in administering the tax law and solving problems I benefited from during my time at Treasury and who has mentored so many others. Thank you, Kevin. Brian Meehan, who served on the Joint Committee on Taxation while I was at Treasury and whose good judgment and experience I've relied on for many years. Two longtime friends from the Hill, Mark Prater and Janice Mays, whose ability to work on a bipartisan basis inspires and provides hope for the future. Thank you both. There are some individuals who may be in the category of mentees, but one of the things I've come to understand is how much can be learned from those you mentor, and that the best of the mentees will far exceed your ability as a mentor. Gary Wilcox. There's a credit card that's, the logo is don't leave home without it. Well, for years I called Gary that card. Carrie Pugh, Jessica Huff, Itai Grinberg, Armando Gomez, Sindhu Bloom. I have to share the best advice I ever got from a mentee, and this is an exact quote. Pam, you're being too logical. You should stop. It's holding you back. Other advice, always bring beer. And a piece of advice I just received a few minutes ago. I've found a couple of shots of tequila before getting up to speak helps a lot. And then there's the measurement of the increase in email response rate if the subject line is free beer. Finally, there are three members of my Treasury team that I especially want to thank. Eric Solomon, who's a prior award recipient, and all of you know, was the most reliable colleague and friend one could find. Barbara Angus, my international tax counsel, globe-trotted, successfully negotiating tax information exchange agreements with tax havens who decided it was time to abandon bank secrecy. She once had to take me to Switzerland with her to help out, but otherwise she did it all on her own with her capable team. Finally, Drew Lyon. Drew is an economist, not a lawyer, but he's sitting here today anyway. One of the things I realized working with Drew is how much we lawyers operate on the basis of visceral reaction when what we need is cool-headed, thoughtful analysis. In my view, Drew is the finest public finance economist in the country. Unfortunately, he's retiring at the end of June, but I was so fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve with him at the Treasury Department and for the last dozen years. One more recognition, in addition to the support that we all get from our families, there's also the support staff that take care of us all the time. Thank you, Gisette, for being my right hand. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and I've had the privilege of standing on the shoulders of some of the tallest. So now it's time for me to wrap up this part of the program so that it can be turned over to the real reason you're here, to hear from Commissioner Werfel. I want to say that I'm very grateful to Commissioner Werfel for accepting the call to service. He's taken on the responsibility at a very challenging time. The words driving the agenda from both political sides are harsh and angry. Misapplied enforcement and targeting are not the words of Fred Goldberg's kinder, gentler IRS. I recall sitting next to the spouse of a DOJ official at a tax section dinner many years ago. He was a criminal lawyer, and he didn't understand what it was with the tax bar that we'd put so much effort into being helpful to the IRS. I believe the tax section has long been the pillar of the tax system, not the architect of its demise. I trust the section will continue to be that, supporting the essential IRS tasks of collecting the revenue and administering the many social programs that have been entrusted to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pam. I assure everyone this is the last piece before we bring our guest speakers in. First of all, and if you'll hold your applause until I recognize a couple of groups. First of all, our committee leaders, speakers, and section council for all they do to make the job as chair a pleasure in working with all these people. Their tremendous work in putting together all these programs and panels, materials, and so forth. The committee chairs, of course, are the key to the success of the section. We have a number of committee chairs who are rolling off, of course, some continuing. We have new committee chairs coming in, and that's a lot of hard work, and we appreciate all of what they do for the section. Now we have a group of council directors and officers who are rolling off, and I do want to recognize them. They have served for, in many cases, 3 or 2 years in these roles. Tom Greenaway has served as vice chair of Committee of Continuing Legal Education, and he is rolling off. We have 5 council directors, Jennifer Alexander, Jennifer Breen, James Creech, Kathy Fung, and Summer LaPree, who are rolling off after 3 years of dedicated service to the section. Christine Spidell is completing her term as secretary and coming on the council. Lanny Villalobos is completing her term as assistant secretary and stepping up to be secretary of the section. Let's give all of these groups and people a hand.
Okay. Stay here. Wells, stay here. So one more quick thing before we move on to the program. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Michael. I'm the chair-elect of the tax section. Wells is the section chair and will remain section chair through August. But this is his last meeting as section chair. So we want to recognize him. On behalf of the section's leadership, our staff, and our membership, Wells, I want to express our boundless gratitude for the time, energy, and skills you have given us in guiding our section, especially as we have emerged from a difficult period and tried to regain the normalcy of a section calendar. With your dedication, your level-headedness, and your gracious and thoughtful leadership, you have led us through a year in which the section made great strides in our in-person and virtual CLE meetings, our pro bono and our DEI initiatives, our substantive tax guidance, our relationships with the larger ABA, and our efforts to grow and sustain our membership. We thank you, and on everyone's behalf, it is my honor to present you with this Chair's Award as a symbol of our thanks. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. We're now ready to start the discussion, and I'm going to ask Scott Levine, a member of our council who has facilitated putting together these panelists, and which drew us to a sellout crowd here today. Scott is going to introduce our panelists, and I believe they're about ready, with their security detail around, to step up on the podium. Scott?
Thanks, Wells. All right, the main event. It is my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First, Natasha Sarin. Natasha is an associate professor of law at Yale Law School with a secondary appointment at the Yale School of Management in the finance department. Previously, she served as deputy assistant secretary for economic policy and later as a counsel to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at the U.S. Treasury Department, where her work focused on narrowing the gap between the taxes owed by the American public and those collected by the Internal Revenue Service. I also want to mention that she was instrumental in the current project that the IRS will be working on, their strategic plan. Prior to her government service, Natasha was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School and the Wharton School. Her research centers on public finance and financial regulation with work on tax policy, household finance, insurance, and macroprudential risk management. I'm not even sure what that is, but that sounds really hard. Her scholarship has been covered in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times, among other publications. So please welcome our first guest, Natasha Sarin. Okay, oh, right, well, all right. Well, they're both here, apparently, so we'll do the... Next, let me have my, again, pleasure to introduce our 50th Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Danny Werfel.
Oh my gosh.
I think
He planned that. He planned it. Wow.
that's actually our moderator, but we're... All right, we'll try to call him out later. So as Commissioner, okay, everybody settle down. As Commissioner, Danny presides over the nation's tax system, which collects approximately $4 trillion in tax revenue each year, representing about 96% of the total gross receipts of the United States. Commissioner Werfel oversees an agency of about 85,000 employees and an annual budget of more than $12 billion. Prior to becoming commissioner, he was the global leader of Boston Consulting Group's public sector practice, where he worked with government agencies worldwide on finances, service delivery, transformation plans, and risk assessment initiatives. Before joining BCG in 2014, Commissioner Werfel served in the federal government for more than 15 years, including 7 months as acting commissioner of the IRS from May to December 2013. Prior to his appointment as acting commissioner, he was controller of the Office of Management and Budget, where he led efforts across the federal government to improve program integrity, including all areas of financial management, financial reporting, and accounting standards. During his tenure as controller, Commissioner Werfel assumed the responsibility of Deputy Director of Management, where he oversaw government-wide efforts to reform and improve personnel, IT, acquisition, and performance management. During his OMB career, he served under 9 different directors in both Republican and Democratic administrations and held various other positions. Please join me in welcoming our 50th Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Danny Werfel. The floor is yours.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for being here today, and I see many friends in the audience, and we're just really grateful to be able to have this conversation. I also want to both congratulate Pam and echo Pam's deep gratitude to Commissioner Werfel for agreeing to be at the helm of the agency at this tremendously exciting, albeit complicated and challenging time for tax administration. And maybe that's where it makes sense for us to start. You are the new leader of the IRS at a moment when the agency has just received a truly historic infusion of resources to modernize tax administration. And so I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts both as to what we're already seeing as a result of those new resources, and also what the next few years in your dream world are going to look like for the IRS.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. And, I've gotten this question a lot around, taking the job at this moment, and, a lot of jokes about it's the toughest job in DC, or you're going to be the least well-liked person in the United States of America. And the reality is I feel incredibly blessed to be part of something so historic and important, and humbled by the confidence that the President and the Secretary of Treasury have in me to take this on. To answer your question, the first thing that pops into my head is the employees of the IRS and the historic opportunity for us to start a new era of investment versus divestment. This is an organization, as you well know, has been in a world of steep decline in resources over the last 10 to 15 years. During this era, let's call it from 2010 to just before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, it was a constant scramble to figure out how to do more with less. It was facing a reality every day that the requirements were increasing because of changes in the tax code, because of emerging new things that the IRS was called upon to do, because the filers were growing, the population grows, the economy grows, all while the resources are declining. Yet there's still an expectation that things are going to get done, they're going to get done on time. And this organization has been extraordinarily resourceful during this period. It's probably not a story that will be told as much as it should in terms of the way in which the IRS managed through this period of divestment and successfully delivered filing season after filing season. I think what happened once the pandemic hit, and again, now you have that type of disruption and a whole new set of requirements related to the pandemic response, building after these years of resource decline, the bottom finally fell out. And that was obviously disappointing to Americans trying to get through to the IRS, but no more disappointing than the IRS employees who felt, and I've heard this a lot in my first weeks there, who really care deeply about the mission. And so, from my vantage point, I start the job by thinking, how do we take advantage of the fact that we're shifting from an era of divestment into a new era of investment? What are the right tools that the IRS needs, that the employees need to do their jobs effectively across every dimension of the IRS operations? And I spent 10 years out of government reflecting on my time in government, and I spent a lot of hours thinking about, if I ever came back to government in a leadership role, what would I do differently? What have I learned? And I think I've learned a lot. And one of the biggest things I've learned is that you can't be successful unless you take an employee and workforce-centric view to what you're trying to achieve. Obviously there are other dimensions of success, but I've really come into the job thinking, how do we turn the IRS into a high-performing organization, and with this historic opportunity, And if we focus on that, really positive things will happen for the nation and for its taxpayers.
And how do you actually think about implementing against that, right? Because to your point, you have a workforce, some 80,000 people, who have for years and years been without the resources or the tools that they need to do their job. And in some sense, this isn't the first time that the IRS has thought about what would structural change mean for the agency. You know, the Taxpayer First Act called for a big report on what the future of the IRS could look like in a world in which it had tools. It didn't give them the tools, but in a world in which it had tools. So as you think about trying to explain both to your workforce and to the American people that this time is different, how do you do that? Like, how do you bring about that type of cultural change? And what are kind of milestones that you look to along the way as to demonstrate success or proof of concept?
Yeah. Well, first, I think that organizations tend to kind of ebb and flow in terms of their readiness for something new and different. And there are moments, sometimes it's a crisis that creates a lot of opportunity for rapid change. And sometimes the situation presents differently. I think we have a unique moment of ebb and flow where my sense is that this organization is in a receiving mode for potential change. And why is that? Well, I think there is a lot of ongoing stress around what happened in 21 and 22 as our performance on specifically on service, but also in terms of our audit coverage has hit historic lows. And the fact that these funds are provided in a way that they are already enacted. They're mandatory funds. They provide you with the ability to plan for the longer term. And I think often when you are constrained by, and there's good reasons to be constrained by this, but when you're constrained by year over year funding and you don't know what the world might look like 2 years from now, and then you have all the budget uncertainty, continuing resolutions, shutdown threats, all of that come about, it becomes more difficult to get everyone aligned on, yes, we're going down this critical path. Because there's too many people have been around who've seen it's not going to work out, the best laid plans. But another piece that makes us ready for change right now is the nature of this law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the stability that it provides in terms of funding also enables us to do some longer range planning. And that's exciting because it's not just about, what are we going to deliver tomorrow? It's about how can we provide a generational change for the IRS that is going to exist for years and years to come. And I am realizing that I can't come in and rush it. There are things we can do in the short term. There are things we want to get done by next filing season that are going to be impactful, that people will notice, and that will happen. But also, I think there's a commitment to deeper foundational changes that we can make in our technology, in our processes, in our training of employees, and ultimately in our culture that I think the workforce is generally excited about. Of course, there's never unanimity, but my sense is that we are at a moment of readiness for this type of change, and it's very exciting.
It's interesting that you speak to the sort of multi-year nature of this funding, because as you know, that was a very calculated choice, right? As we thought about designing what eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act's budgetary form for the IRS, we thought about the importance of there being stability over the course of the decade, because a lot of these investments, thinking about substantially ramping up compliance coverage of complex taxpayers, or thinking about fundamentally overhauling outdated IT systems, that requires time. It's not going to happen instantaneously or overnight. But on the other hand, and it's great that the funds are multi-year, it's great that they exist and that they're going to exist, knock on wood, for the entirety of the next decade. But that doesn't mean that the pressure that the IRS faces is going to wait. People are going to say, okay, you know what, take your 10 years and let's see what the IRS of the future is able to do. So how do you think about balancing this sort of political and public pressure to show progress immediately against the recognition that you have, which is that some of these changes are going to take years really to fully realize?
Yeah, I think we have to do two things. We have to make meaningful change incrementally in the short term that people can feel, and then we have to communicate it effectively. Let me give you an example. The plan that we issued, the strategic operating plan on April 6th, I refer to that now as my public to-do list. There's 190 projects on there. And it can be difficult, it's a dense document, right? And if I slapped it on the table and asked my aunt to read it, she would not get past page 2, I'm sure. She'd say, we're very proud of you, Danny, but I'm not reading this plan. But if I sat down with her and I said, okay, there are 4 ways that taxpayers engage with the IRS. First, they'd like to walk in and see us in person in our taxpayer assistance centers. So if we don't have funding, we have closed centers, understaffed, long lines, and lacking people who want to meet us in that way lack the access. With funds, we can open more taxpayer assistance centers, including in rural and underserved areas. We can extend hours, they can be fully staffed, we can eliminate lines going down the street, we can open up Saturday hours, we can engage with communities around how to kind of offer assistance to low-income individuals who are having trouble applying for EITC. There's all these cool things we can do in person with the right funding, so walk-in centers. The second way that people engage with the IRS is they call us. And if we don't have the right funds in place, people won't be there to answer the phone, and that can be extremely frustrating, and then you're on hold for a long time. The other challenge is that we're not investing in a more modern call center, because if you call around to your favorite airline or retail or bank or financial services institution, you will notice attributes in those calls that we don't have because we haven't had the ability to invest. So we're going to make the call center better. The third way taxpayers interact with us is they go on our website, irs.gov. And if they go on that website and they find it difficult to navigate, it doesn't have nearly the type of user-friendly formats and tools that my bank or my mortgage company has, that's concerning. And then the fourth way is they pull out their smartphones and they want to go on an application. And that we have a long way to go on that, but we do have Where's My Refund, which is a good start. So 4 different ways. Now, what I can then explain is here's how we're incrementally improving each of those channels over time. Here's what we've been able to do already with the Inflation Reduction Act funds. We're already spending money to open those taxpayer assistance centers. I think we've opened 16 since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. Obviously, we hired 6,000 customer service reps, and we dramatically increased our performance on the phone. We also include new bots in the call center. You can now, in an automated way, get a transcript, set up an installment agreement if you owe less than $25,000. These things didn't exist before the Inflation Reduction Act, and on and on. We can start to demonstrate. And so I think what we can do is explain that each month or filing season or quarter, however you want to think about your calendar, if we can show incremental, meaningful improvements, then people will say, they're actually changing. They're moving. If we just issue a, kind of a dashboard of how we're doing on the 190 projects, it won't resonate as much. So I believe one of my jobs as commissioner is to figure out that Rosetta Stone, that translation of all the various plates that are spinning, but then how does it impact you as a taxpayer, as a citizen? It gets a little bit harder for some of the foundational things we have to do with our technology to make that plain language explanation, But one thing that I would talk about is data security. And there's some fundamental things that the IRS has to get right for the whole thing to work. And there's a few of them. And one of them is the data has to be secure. And so, if you have old technology that isn't as modern as it could be, that we're not making the investments, we have, for example, a long list of Inspector General TIGTA recommendations on things we can do to strengthen the data security of our systems. And when I look at that report card and I talk to the team and I say, why haven't we closed these? We haven't had the money. You have to prioritize. Well, now with these fundings, we can start, as I said in my Ways and Means hearing, try to get an A on that TIGTA report card. Now, going back to my aunt, I have to explain that when you send your taxpayer information in, do you want it in an old system that didn't get an A on a report card, or a modern system that the oversight entities say, yep, thumbs up, it's secure? So working through how to make these explanations and then showing that actually the Inspector General scorecard went up in grades, these are the ways I think we can explain how we're putting the money to work effectively.
And you kind of already started to speak to this, but there are sort of differences across the Inflation Reduction Act with respect to how different functions of the IRS received funding. So, and I'm kind of curious for you to engage a little bit on what I call color of money issues, right? In taxpayer service, you got, and there are complex reasons for this we can all talk about, but you got approximately a year's worth of funding for that type of work in mandatory funds in the Inflation Reduction Act, about $3.5 billion of new funding. In the area of enforcement, the account that is enforcement, you got about 8 times an annual appropriation in enforcement, about $45 billion in new funding. So as and you acknowledge this in the plan, the IRS acknowledges this very explicitly, like there's so many investments we want to make in taxpayer service, things that Nina and things that Aaron have been calling for years, and we actually don't have the resources in the Inflation Reduction Act to support all of that work. So as you think about the IRS of the next several years, both how are you going to balance the investments you make across the agency in a way that is derivative of the funding that you've already received, and also how are you thinking about articulating the need for additional funds and where those needs are in the agency going forward?
Yeah. So, I'm growing up in government in the Office of Management and Budget. I've always felt that I've had this kind of mindset of we will do the best we can with what Congress in their wisdom enacted, right? And so I arrive at the IRS in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it provides roughly over $3 billion, but not more than $4 billion on services improvements. My mindset is, how can we put that money to work most effectively? There's roughly $40 billion for enforcement and roughly another $40 billion for what I call backbone, like operation support, really important. How do we put that to work most effectively? One of the benefits of being the IRS commissioner and being the IRS is like I can defer from debating some of these policy calls that's really more in the Treasury. I'm in the mindset of, you tell me what you enact and we will do our absolute best to implement. But I will tell you what keeps me up at night. The reality is that the whole plan starts to degrade if our base funding isn't raised. Like this is a mistake that I think is being made in terms of the world's understanding of IRS funding, which is the Inflation Reduction Act is meant for us to modernize and improve, and our base budget is how we run the daily train schedules, right? And so what happens is if there's more people calling, more filers, more complexities, more changes to the tax code, and I think I asked the team for some stats on this, and there was like something like, they gave me a period of time like 2019, the summer of 2019 to the summer of 2021, and there was close to 1,000 changes to the tax code or something like that. all of that has to be managed in our base budget on a day-to-day basis. And what happened is in fiscal year 23, our budget stayed relatively same at its base. And so what we had to do was pull money from that services fund in order to answer the phones, in order to keep the current train schedules. You know, the analogy that I used in my Ways and Means hearing was this idea of a train schedules. And I said, look, if there are people crowding the platform more and more because the next train isn't coming through, that's a problem. You have to deal with it, right? So we had to pull money from the Inflation Reduction Act to get those trains moving and get those people off the platforms and where they need to go, because we weren't given the funding to do that. By doing that, that means we're not modernizing the train schedules. We're not building more trains. We're not optimizing what we do to keep those in a sustainable way, those platforms in the right level of crowd control. And that's what keeps me up at night. I'm less concerned about, you only have $3 billion, what are you going to do? That is like, I think we can do a lot with $3 billion. And I think if we can prove how much we did, then we are in a better footing to get more money in the out years. But if you're not going to allow us to use that money because you're not going to fund our incremental base budget, then that is the concern. And so I have a job to do, which is to convince the budget formulation people in Washington, which is a lot of different people, but I have to convince them that by not funding our incremental base budget, you are doing harm to taxpayers. It shouldn't be a political issue. It's like, this is the tax system we have, and we need to operate it. It shouldn't be political to match to right-size the footprint of people on the phone or people who are assessing for tax compliance to the size of the tax system we have.
You're preaching to a choir here, and I feel very deeply that everything that you have said, Commissioner, is right. I think that you also will acknowledge that, like, you're in a pretty complicated political moment. It shouldn't be political, but it is. And you're at a point right now where, for example, in the context of the debt ceiling dramas, you're hearing calls from some critics for rescinding these new transformative resources that the agency has received, as opposed to making sure that we give you enough sort of base appropriations on an annual basis so that you can do the modernization work going forward. And I know you've spent a lot of time in the last several weeks talking to Congress about many of these same issues. I'm kind of curious for, like, your best pitch to legislators, to the American people, for why they should care about the fact that the IRS has got these resources, and why it's the case that it's imperative that we support this work over the years to come, as opposed to making it harder for the agency to make these investments.
Well, it's interesting. When I'm pitching to Congress, I can make it really practical for them, which is when we were not when we were at historic low levels of service, they were getting phone calls to their office because they couldn't get through to the IRS, right? And so it was frustrating for them, and that's a bipartisan frustration in terms of why are people calling us for help with their taxes? Why aren't they calling the IRS, and why aren't they getting through? And so that's kind of a visceral thing. And then the point on the modernization money is to say, like, now you have to decide, what do you want out of this IRS service? Do you want us to just be able to have enough people to answer the phone for a few years and then be right back where we started? Or do you want us to be able to sustain in perpetuity a level of service where people aren't calling you anymore, they're only calling us, which is the right answer? And not only are we answering the calls, we're providing things like a callback option. We are giving them better online tools so that they don't even have to call in, because they can get done on 3 minutes on their smartphone, something that would take them 35 minutes through a phone call with us. It's a question that I try to convince them that you're only hurting your constituents, right? Because they're the ones that are going to have to call and get in these long queues on the IRS call center versus the other things that we can do. And that's and then on the enforcement side or the compliance side, The pitch there is, I said earlier, there's a few foundational elements for this whole thing to work. Data security is one of them. Equity is another. And, if you are a middle or low income taxpayer, a mom and pop small business, and you live in a reality where the IRS has the capacity and the tools to fully assess your balance due and ensure that you're paying what you owe, but we do not have that same capacity for wealthy and very wealthy taxpayers, that doesn't feel that equitable, right? And so the pitch is that in order to get to the right level of equity so that people believe that our tax system is fair, and we all know that our system operates it's grounded on trust, that we have to build that capacity. And if you pull that money back, then we're right back where we started with an inequitable outcome, a lack of fairness, that the IRS has the capacity to assess people at middle and lower income levels, but not at higher income levels. That doesn't feel balanced. And what the Inflation Reduction Act does is allow us to achieve balance.
And as you think about achieving a more equitable system of tax administration, investing in sort of world-class customer service, you're going to need both to grow the workforce, but also a fundamentally different type of workforce, right? You're going to need to invest in data scientists and economists and cybersecurity experts and partnership law experts in a way that both the agency hasn't had the capacity to do in the last decade plus, but also just doesn't have the infrastructure to recruit from these types of areas. And so how do you think about and especially in a tight labor market, right? How do you think about your recruitment and hiring of new types of workers for the agency? And also, as we're talking about pitches, and many in this room are relevant to this question, what's your pitch for why people should be coming to work at the IRS at this historic moment?
Yeah. So there's a lot in that question. I'll start with the pitch, though. It's the same thing that drew me in, right? First of all, if you have a sense somewhere inside you that public service is something that you aspire to be a part of, then often you aspire to serve the public in a way that has impact. And the bigger and more material and significant that impact, or the more compelling or acute the problem is that you're going to solve, the more exciting it is and the more rewarding it is to be a part of a public service mission. And at the IRS, the decisions that we make impact every household in America. They are, the idea of having impact at scale is enormously relevant at the IRS. Now, add in the reality that without the IRS, it's kind of a keystone to this whole operation of the U.S. government and our society. Because, and I always try to reflect and remember all the things that we have so great in America, all the ways in which public funding touches us in a positive way and improves our quality of life, safe skies and safe food supplies and running water and electricity and law enforcement and national security, all these things that together create the life that we have in America, imperfect as it is, but truly something that we all should appreciate. That all falls apart if the IRS isn't carrying out its mission to provide, as Scott mentioned, $4 trillion in receipts each year. So the next part of the pitch is this is an absolutely critical mission. It's a bit unheralded. If you also have to be the type of person that knows you're coming into something that no one's going to throw a parade for you when you get it right, and will excoriate you when you get it wrong. The analogy that I use there is the NFL referee. They get the holding call wrong, and 80,000 people will boo them. But guess what? They get the holding call right. 80,000 people will boo them. And I take it one step further, even now with instant replay, as they're using technology to get their calls right, and then 80,000 people look up on the screen and see, the refs actually got the call right, they'll still boo, right? And nobody throws a parade for the ref, and that's okay. The refs are critical. The game can't happen without them. They can't leave the field just because they get booed. They should be proud of the work they do, and so should we at the IRS. The other part of the pitch is like, this is the moment, right? This is a transformational moment. We are building something. We are not scrambling to figure out how to do more with less. We are actually building an organization that will serve future generations to come. And so again, it's not just that the day-to-day stuff has impact on today's America. The work that we're doing right now, because we're entering this period of investment, is going to serve future generations of Americans. And one other thing about the IRS, it often, not only does it administer the tax system, but it often finds itself in a position to have impact on broader positives to society. And the best example of that is the energy credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, right? I mean, if you think about what the government can do to change industry behavior on carbon footprint, I think a lot of very smart people think the tax incentives that are within the Inflation Reduction Act are potentially the most powerful lever the U.S. government has. And guess who's at the center of making sure that those, the bird, the sign.
Dramatic effect.
And yet I will persist. So. And let me round out the pitch on this idea of a diverse set of skills that we need. It's, I think the iconic nature of the IRS is it's we're all auditors, and you in this room know that's not true. I mean, maybe the next level is like it's auditors and people who answer phone calls, and that's not true that that's all that we are. But we also have to diversify our skill sets to build for the future. We need to be more savvy in data science, in technology, in engineering, in economics, in the law. All of these things are, as I started my remarks today, the whole thing hinges on the workforce who was actually carrying out these important roles. It doesn't happen magically. It happens because there's a workforce there. And it's super exciting to think about, for example, what we could do with analytics to shape a different footprint, not just in enforcement, but in services too. Think about the algorithms and the analytics that can help us understand peak and lower demand of needs for taxpayers, being able to better predict as tax laws change what the types of questions that might come in so we can meet people where they are. And then you shift to the enforcement side and think about how powerful an analytic engine can be to help us identify where the areas of non-compliance are, in particular among high wealth filers, where there's so much complexity when you look at a multinational corporation, when you looked at different currencies that are out there now, when you look at the complexity of partnerships today, and just the complexity of economic behavior that's out there, we have this ability to significantly more optimize our enforcement resources in the face of that complexity. And I think it would be incredibly interesting and challenging endeavor to come in and help us with the analytic frame for how we're going to do that. And there's a lot of people in this room that have the type of input, the insight, the understanding that we currently lack at the IRS that can be part of that journey.
And maybe we have a couple minutes left. I see Scott coming up. Maybe we can take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, so there are... There we go. So Commissioner Warfel has been kind enough to offer up some time to answer some questions from the audience. There's 2 microphones that are getting set up around the room. So why don't we anybody interested in asking a question, why don't we get up and start the Q&A. And don't be shy.
It always takes one, and then the questions
And the
come
floodgates.
in. The floodgates, yes.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Marty Davidoff from New Jersey. One of the things that has been proposed many times, maybe only by me, is that when the IRS sets up these internal working committees, we're going to have a team that's going to improve this. We're going to have a team that improves this. That you include practitioners on those teams. And the answer has always been, but they can't have PII. Well, there's a way to do it. I'm sure you can figure it out. Pay us $1 a year and put us on those internal sessions. So I ask you, if you haven't already considered it, if you've considered it, what's your say on it? If you haven't already considered it, I hope you'll consider putting practitioners on these teams to be working hand in hand, not just to be on liaison committees, but to actually see the data, see both sides, see your challenges internally, and for you then to hear directly those insights. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I'm glad you raised it because it's another part of the culture change that I think is important. And there is, and we probably have a whole seminar on why this is, but there is a long-standing history of kind of the IRS being close hold with everything that we do. I think 6103 has a lot to do with that, and just kind of the nature of privacy laws and the fact that that there's a lot of things that we can't tip our hand to if we're going to do our jobs effectively. But I think there's a tendency for government agencies, and the IRS is no different, to over-rotate too much and therefore put up the brick walls everywhere. And I think we can change that.
Yeah, just pay us minimum wage for our 10 hours a month that we're going to volunteer to help you. Thank you. And then we're employees and we're covered by that wall.
Anyone else? I'm happy to give Danny more questions.
Yeah, you
but
should.
Oh,
There's
yeah, I
a
see
question
you.
back there.
When are you going to get rid of the fax machines?
Another great example of the need to modernize. And it's funny, I say, people want to reach us in different ways. They want to walk in, they want to file in paper, and we'd prefer them not. I should add into my line, people want to fax us. I don't think there's a lot of people who want to fax us. So I will make that part of the endeavor. I do think we want to be significantly more digital going forward, as long as we can do it in a fair way where we're not kind of preventing access issues. But that is absolutely the idea, is to move from fax machines to smartphones. I know we're behind the curve on that, but we have our eye on the prize.
Sort of a related point, we have a lot of taxpayers living overseas now, and I know that tax compliance is especially hard for them, including just actually getting payment to the service, particularly if all their financial life is outside the United States. I don't know what the technological barriers are there, but I'm wondering if that's something that can be put fairly high in the priorities.
Yeah, that came up in one of my hearings, and as a result, I got a lot deeper on it, and I'm starting to get my hands around the issue, and it's this is a great example of the various layers of taxpayers that are out there. It's a diverse portfolio. Some are in rural areas, some can't afford to engage with us digitally, and some are overseas and have extremely complicated issues, and often maybe don't even have a balance due with us, but have to spend a lot of money and time to kind of register that, and it's not all that helpful. So this is definitely something that, as we try to meet taxpayers where they are, whether they're down the street or are expatriates, that's part of how we can demonstrate improvement for all these different taxpayers.
Thank you.
When people look at the U.S. system versus the system of other countries, our system is one that relies very heavily on voluntary compliance, more so perhaps than other countries. You've talked about a number of ways of essentially removing obstacles for people who want to comply. Do you also have thoughts on how to encourage voluntary compliance?
Yeah. Well, when I think about voluntary compliance, I think about trust and the importance of trust. One of the first questions that I got when I got to the IRS from one of the executives was, philosophically, do I think the IRS should be, build it and they will come, or meet the taxpayers where they are? And I'm very much in the mindset of meeting the taxpayers where they are. I think that we can build trust by connecting people better to what their responsibilities are or what benefits they have. And in terms of this idea of volunteering, I am very much interested in exploring, like, what are some of the things, like safe harbors, coming forward, saying, like, this is what I'm planning to do, to kind of meet us in the middle in terms of an area that might be confusing and make it less ultimately leading to something combative, but finding kind of a common area where we're meeting taxpayers that might be having a concern with one of our interpretations or a concern that they have about a compliance action that we're taking. I absolutely think there's ways in which to meet all types of taxpayers where they are and find a sensible solution. And that's part of, again, going back to this common theme, investing. It always, in order to change, in order to research new policies, new procedures, it requires investment in testing these things, in training people, in bringing in outside stakeholders and engaging them. All of that requires personnel, insight, and that doesn't come for free. So a lot of what is being suggested here should be part of this idea of how we modernize going forward. And it's not just about technology, it's about engagement.
Maybe I think we have time for just one more question.
Sure. Hi, Mr. Commissioner. What is your plan to strengthen enforcement against employers who are determined to have misclassified their workers as independent contractors, given we've had Treasury Inspector General reports that have found over the years that the SS8 unit has not been able to successfully follow up to actually enforce those determinations against employers?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'm going to lift up your question a bit because I think a smart approach to the tax gap, a smart approach to enforcement is to understand where the root causes and where are these issues, and then to assess how we're going to prioritize them more effectively. And there's a lot of factors that might go in to how you decide where you're going to lean in more urgently and sooner. Obviously, the materiality, the size of the balance due that we expect by taking this on. It may be something that we think if we can unlock better enforcement in this area, there are adjacent areas of compliance that will follow suit because something might be more isolated versus connected and entrenched in an area that if we go after this, then we'll see more compliance in and around it. Or it might be something that by symbolism, because it is something that is really, really important to root out, because if it's going on, it degrades public trust, or we might go after that even if it's not as material. And so for me, taking your question, I would want to understand where that type of potential noncompliance fits in a broader portfolio of noncompliance so that we can make smart decisions. And this is coming back to the point is like, This work that I'm describing is really, really critical for us to strengthen and become significantly more sophisticated than we are today, and this is where the recruitment comes in. We're building a team that can help us in ways that we haven't been able to before, drive that type of portfolio view, come up with the calculus that I described very roughly. It's a lot more complicated and sophisticated than I just described it, and then figure out the right sequence to move forward. And it may be that the issue that you raise comes in early as ticking the balanced scorecard and it's a go. And it may be that it's something, it's not that we would ignore it, but it might not be the kind of like the first major wave. And these are things that I'm looking forward to really rolling up my sleeves on as I get deeper into the job on the enforcement side. I will amplify that all of this is going to occur for wealthy and very wealthy filers, because that's where the focus is. We're not changing our audit rates with respect to individuals and businesses that make less than $400,000. So as a result, I think it's important for us to figure out how these strategies center on our wealthiest tax filers.
And with that, I think thanks to all of you, and thanks to Commissioner Werfel for doing this.
Commissioner and Natasha, we appreciate very much your very engaging discussion, and I think everybody here enjoyed it thoroughly. We don't have many empty seats compared to what we started with. In addition, because of our audio taping, audio tapes will be distributed to all 1,700 registrants at the meeting and available to section members who were not here. So this will be something that will mean a lot to our section. For those of you who are wondering what happened to the bird, the security detail assures me it's just part of their job, and it was done in a very humane way, and everything is fine. But we look forward to seeing everyone virtually at the fall meeting, and then at the January mid-year meeting in San Francisco. Thank you for your attendance, and thank you for the program.